Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Captain Scott Craverath, the commanding officer of the Vanderbilt Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps. On behalf of the university, who supports our unit spectacularly, and our NROTC alumni organization, whose work in support of our unit has and continues to be instrumental in the health, well-being, and education of both our midshipmen and their support for this event, now in its 5th year, I'm honored to welcome retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Thomas Kolditz, Vanderbilt University Class of '78, as our keynote speaker for our annual symposium. This year's focus is on leadership lessons from the War on Terror, and I'm very proud to introduce a foremost expert and internationally recognized authority on crisis leadership and leadership in extreme contexts to speak with us today. Tom Kolditz is a professor in the practice of leadership and management and the director of the Leader Development Program at the Yale School of Management. A retired brigadier general, he was responsible for teaching, research, and outreach activities in leadership, psychology, sociology, and management at West Point for a full dozen years. He also served as the founding director of the West Point Leadership Center. General Kolditz has lived and studied leadership and management from every angle. He served on 4 continents in his 34 years of Army service. He is a fellow in the American Psychological Association, in the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society. His most recent book, titled In Extremis Leadership, Leading as If Your Life Depended on It, was based on more than 100 interviews taken on the ground in Iraq during combat operations. Our speaker holds a BA from Vanderbilt University, 3 additional master's degrees, and a PhD in social psychology from the University of Missouri. He has presented leadership context and experience to more than 150 governmental, corporate, and social sector audiences worldwide. As a professor, he has led academic seminars or given lectures to students from a variety of national and international universities, service academies, and more than 10 major metropolitan law enforcement, firefighting, and public service academies. He is a frequent contributor to both national and international news agencies. I could go on, but the rest of the details are in your flyer, and you don't want to listen to me. Sir, welcome back to your alma mater. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Tom Kolditz.
Well, that's great. Can you hear me all right? All right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the introduction. I'm incredibly honored to be at Vanderbilt University speaking, and I haven't been back here really since the 90s, and then for just a very brief period. But I was able to run around Vanderbilt this morning. I got up and decided to go for a run, and I think I ran on every sidewalk at Vandy. And I'm amazed at how little has changed and how beautiful it still is. And I know that many of you in this room have been very supportive of Vanderbilt throughout the years, and so thank you for your support, and it's really great to be here. As I thought about what I might speak to tonight, I wanted to be sure that I could speak to at least 2 audiences. The first are these people you see kind of in the back of the room here, the midshipmen and the cadets, who really inspired me today when I had lunch with them, and the idea that they are willing to commit to service in the kind of world that we have right now that's really unstable and unpredictable is an inspiration to me. So I'll definitely be talking to you all. But you know, I teach at a business school, and the things I talk about when it comes to crisis leadership really are not limited to military and police and firefighting applications, because all of us have to deal with things in our lives that put a knot in our gut and force us to lead in our businesses when we see them threatened, in our families where we're afraid for the physical well-being of our family members due to disease or other kinds of concerns, and in elite businesses where, you know, the very real possibility of the loss of $100 million or $500 million or the business itself puts people on edge. So that's kind of the second group, is all the rest of you. And I'm going to be very careful to make sure that, that I talk about this in a way that you'll be able to digest. A couple things about the way I approach leadership and crisis leadership and bringing together this topic about what at least I learned during the War on Terror. I feel like leadership instruction, whether it's at West Point or at Yale or here at Vanderbilt should be evidence-based. There is probably no field that has more junk books in it than the leadership field. And so consequently, if you don't stay pretty close to research, you don't stay pretty close to some data, it's easy to get out there with some pretty wacky stuff. And so when I tell you this story, and really my presentation is more of a story about how to develop knowledge around crisis leadership in dangerous places, you're going to see that the intent there was to gather evidence and to proceed, not to create some sort of theory about crisis leadership, but just to be descriptive. I just wanted to know how people who are in crisis all the time lead. Just a descriptive study. You know, nothing too theoretical or experimental. I just wanted to know how it really happens in the real world. Because at West Point at the time, I went there in the year 2000. I had just left an artillery battalion command in Korea, and I thought, hey, why not go to West Point? It's not like there are any wars going on or anything. And shortly after I went there, of course, we were committed. And I was kind of surprised to see that there wasn't any good evidence-based content there on how to lead in dangerous places, which was astonishing to me. That for years we could just kind of tell one another war stories and expect for that to be about leadership. So let's move into this, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how we learn about crisis leadership. I'll tell you about a little bit of research that I did to figure this all out, to write the book, to do that, and then I'll give you a framework, and the framework is going to tell you how things are different when people are afraid. What people need from their leaders when they're deeply afraid. Whether that fear comes from the failure of a business that's going to be a life-changing event for the leader and other families, or whether it's the kind of threat that we see in combat, that's a physical threat. So in a moment, I'm going to ask the folks upstairs to play a little video for us. And I like to start out with this video because it sets the tone, first of all. And then secondly, you'll be able to see in this video three very distinct perspectives from three different people about how to lead in a crisis. The first person you're going to hear from in this video is a young soldier named Channing Moss. And Channing Moss had the unfortunate experience of being wounded in Afghanistan. So he's going to talk about being wounded and where his head was during this event. And then the next person you're going to hear from is a West Point graduate. His name is a surgeon. His name's John O. And Dr. O is going to talk about his view of crisis and how he operates in environments where a lot is on the line. And then the last person you're going to hear from is a fellow named Danny Brown. He is an explosives ordnance disposal technician, a hurt locker guy. And he's going to talk about how to stay focused and how he gets through the crisis. I will tell you, this is a little bit graphic. There's some blood in this, some operating room scenes that are filmed by a soldier with his own video camera. So if you know, blood on TV causes you concern or something like that, you know, my recommendation would be that you toughen up a little bit. Because we're going to watch it anyway. So y'all, could you please roll that video?
In 2006, we were on a mounted patrol in Afghanistan, and we were coming around a bend, and we were ambushed from the left. They began to shoot small arms fire and then heavy arms fire with RPGs. One RPG went over the head of our truck, and I was struck with the RPG that went into my abdomen. It came through the top of my Humvee, and it pierced my pelvic bone, my pelvic wing, and came through and got enlarged in my right thigh, and it got stuck there. I just kept asking when was the chopper coming, because I thought I'd never get back to my family. I thought I was just gonna die right there. I felt the cool breeze of the chopper just coming in, and I could see that yellow smoke. And I thought about my wife and my girls growing up without me, in some of those quiet moments I had, like when I had my eyes closed on the plane, I just thought I was gonna die. I just thought they weren't gonna be able to save me. That I was never gonna be able to, you know, if I did survive, I wasn't gonna be able to function. You know, I felt that peace in one moment, that if I did die, that I died for the right cause and I did the right thing. But you want to fight and you want to live, and your inner feeling is to fight. You know, you can go on, you can do this. We touched down in OE, and I can remember them just rushing like to get me out, just rushing, and they sat me on the table, and they started cutting all my clothes off, and I can remember just Captain O looking at me like, he's got a live ordnance in him, everybody get out.
After they had removed all his clothing, I could clearly see this rod sticking out of his hip, so I was actually looking at it, and I had never seen an RPG before, but I realized that this looked like some kind of munition because it had fins on it, so it's kind of hard to imagine any other rod that would have fins on it sticking out of somebody's hip. The guideline is you're not supposed to bring them in the aid station. You actually leave them outside and you treat them as what we call an expectant patient. So you treat him like he's going to blow up. So which means that you put him outside the aid station, you take precautions to keep him away from the facility, but essentially you treat him like an expectant patient, like he's not going to survive. You know, I was scared shitless, basically. I'd never been so scared in my whole life. And you look at the guy and then you think, there's no way I'm going to let this guy die. It just can't happen. It can't happen. EOD came in, we're trying to figure out what this bomb was, and EOD was saying that it could go off at any second. This thought went through my head that these were the last people I was ever going to see, potentially. I said, if this thing goes off, I just want you all to know it's been great working with you. And that was it. That was it.
You all have an RPG inside, a possible RPG inside the soldier. Worst case scenario, we could bring the roof down on top of us, but you would already be dead before the roof hit the ground. We took an x-ray of him to see what we had inside him, and we found out that we had was just from this portion of, this is an RPG here, just from this portion back and the tail fins, which is another additional 4 to 6 inches, was impaled inside him from above his left hip into his right thigh. Now we worried about the fact that there was a detonator, and which still had an explosive charge to it, but not as great, that could wound the surgeons, kill the patient, and wound ourselves while we're working.
It was imperative to get this thing out as quick as possible in order to complete the operation and save his life. At that point, I don't think anybody thought about the danger to themselves. They just thought about getting this thing out as fast as possible.
It was a feeling of tension, of course, but of amazement at the same time that we were able to be involved in doing something like this, of removing an RPG from a person that was still alive. Our whole thought the entire time was how to keep Cheney Moss alive. The moment until I had that RPG outside of Cheney Moss, it was complete silence. I was inside myself. I was knowing what I was doing, and had no distractions until the moment that RPG was out of my hands. Then that's when the world came back into play, and it was like just a vacuum was released, and all the noise, all the commotion, and I just sat down and I started shaking. It was complete release, just complete amazement and release at the same time. And oh my God, we just finished something that saved a kid's life.
I think I did it because I knew that he had a chance to make it, but the basic reason was because Channing Moss was looking at me and talking and breathing, and that's why I did it. Sorry. And for me to do it once, you know, when he shows up, I don't think that's a very heroic thing. For these guys to go outside the wire and put themselves at risk and lives at risk every day, that's heroic.
From my chain of command to the people that I was with on the ground when I got hurt, to the pilot that actually took the initiative to fly me out when I got the OE to the 4 surgical team, all those people that were volunteers and volunteered to do what they had to do, and they could have died at any time. They could have blew up, and they could be missing arms, legs right now. Because I still had a live ordinance in me. They took the initiative. It's speechless. Thank God for them people being in the position that they were in at the time. Thank them. I mean, I owe them my life. I owe them my life.
All right, that's a crisis. You know, that is a powerful crisis. But if you listen to those people, you know, you listen to those people that were involved together on that, you heard 3 very distinct, separate perspectives on the crisis. So let's start with Channing Moss. You know, he's laying there, he's hurt, he's in pain. He is not worried about the liberation of Afghanistan. You know, he is not worried about higher order reasons for being there. What he's worried about is his family. He's worried about the most fundamental things. Am I going to be able to provide support for my family? Am I even going to make it through this? And if I am, you know, what am I going to be able to offer? One of the things that's important to understand in crisis and in other aspects of leadership is that while leaders, like the folks in the back row here, while they're busy trying to run the show and they're deeply invested in the mission, many of the people who work from you, they just want to get home. They just want a paycheck, they want to take care of their families, and they want to get home. And it's the same with line workers in factories, and that perspective heightens in a crisis. And in a crisis, oftentimes the leaders are really focused on the mission and getting everything done, and they think all these people behind them are kind of the same way, but that's not what happens. People go back to the basics. Fast forward a little bit to John O., to the surgeon. He's focused on doing his job, but he said some interesting things there. You remember when he said, the policy is you're not supposed to bring him into an aid station? He set aside managerial policy on his own initiative to bring that soldier in. And he pulled together a group of volunteers because his view, his estimate as a leader, was that there was more upside than downside to that circumstance. But he had every opportunity to say, well, U.S. Army medical doctrine says this person doesn't come into the aid station. And nothing would have happened to him as a surgeon. Okay? And I've talked to his boss and his boss's boss about that decision. One of the things you need to remember about junior level leaders is that the propensity and the expectation is there for you to set aside rules when you know they're not the right thing to do, or where you think in your mind as a leader that you can make it happen the right way at your level. Ethics is about rules, but morality is about doing the right thing. And so consequently, you may be called on at some time as a leader in a crisis to respond to pressure by setting aside managerial policy. And by doing that, you risk your job. You risk everything. But you'll do it because you know it's the right thing to do. And in the context of business, the thing to remember is when that business comes under pressure, there are people at a lot of different levels that will feel compelled to set aside managerial policy. And they're going to do it without asking you if you're the CEO. So you have to do work up front with these people. You have to do work up front to make sure that when they do that, when they make those kinds of decisions, that they're thinking just the way you do. And it comes in terms of giving them your intent rather than just rules. But, you know, sort of what's the intent behind what you're doing? And it comes with developing trust with them over time. But don't think, even in a high compliance organization like investment banking, that people are going to follow the rules when there's a big crisis, because they will feel compelled to do what they think is the right thing to do for the company and for themselves. Ironically, this week, the Security Exchange Commission made history by awarding a whistleblower $14 million. $14 million award to a whistleblower by the SEC. That's been done. The highest award that was given before this week was $125,000. So people are going to make their own decisions. And as leaders, we have to set those up. And then the third person we saw was Danny Brown. And he was a guy that had to pull the RPG out of that soldier and walk out of the tent and put it behind some sandbags and deal with it. And he was also the guy who had to describe how big the bursting charge was inside there and what he thought the probability of it going off during that surgery was. His perspective is a technical expert. His perspective is a knowledgeable person, a content knowledgeable person. And in doing that, you remember how he said he got through that event? Total focus. Total focus outside himself on the task that he was doing. And you notice when he talked about doing his job, he was fine. But when he talked about having done it, that's when he became emotional. That's when he began to shake. And it was the same thing with the physician. When he talked about doing the operation, he was calm. When he talked about having done it, after losing that focus, that's when he was overwhelmed with emotion. So we're going to talk deeply about that. I'm going to explain to you why that happens that way and what you can do to control emotions when you're dealing with some of these dramatic events, whether it's a car accident with your family, or whether it's some kind of shipboard fire, or whether it's a serious business deal that's gone bad and there's a lot of ambiguity and you don't know if you're going to be able to save your company. It's all the same thing. And my PhD's in psychology. I mean, I take a psychological perspective. So as I talk through these things, they apply in every relationship you have. They apply in your personal life as much as they might in your professional lives. Okay, could we have slides back again, please? So hopefully I didn't hit a button here or something. But just kind of let me talk this through to you a little bit, and we'll keep going and we'll get the slides up in a second. The three perspectives, the follower perspective that you saw from Channing Moss, the technical perspective you saw from Danny Brown, and this leadership perspective where someone's taking charge, taking responsibility for the whole circumstance. It's not like you will hold just one of those perspectives in a crisis. That's not going to happen. You will be in all three of those perspectives as you cycle through. You might be able to lead the people in your company and do what you think is the right thing while you're dealing with the crisis, and you may even be able to take this technical perspective where you're highly focused and you're not very emotional about it, but then you're going to get in your car and you're going to start driving home, and you're going to start thinking about what this crisis means to you. And that's when you become Channing Moss. That's when you begin to think that way, and you have to be ready for that, and you have to not balk at that. Not balk at that. That's just part of what you do. So what I'd like to do now is talk to you about some research that I did to really dig into this topic and to learn more about it. And by doing that, I think we'll get to the point where you'll have a better understanding of why I'm saying the things I am and what kind of evidence we had to create the curriculum and create the framework to do this. The first study that I did was a study in Iraq that Scott mentioned, and it was a great piece of field research. I pulled together a research team. There were 4 of us. There was myself, there was an industrial organizational psychologist who was a former Army Ranger, there was an Arabic professor from the military academy, and there was an infantry officer who was just the 4th person, because 4 beats 3, and it's easy to do fireman carries with even numbers of people and all of that. So we flew to Kuwait in April of 2003. And if you think back to 2003, you saw cavalry units fighting their way through these blinding sandstorms towards Baghdad. That was April of 2003. And May 1st, 2003 was when George Bush infamously landed on the aircraft carrier and said, mission accomplished, mission accomplished sign. That was May 1st of 2003. At that time, I was in a place called Qasr, Iraq. And in Qasr, there was a prisoner of war facility that was a square kilometer bounded by 80,000 rolls of concertina with 6,000 Iraqi prisoners in it. And they were being cared for by about 1,700 MPs. And I interviewed 36 Iraqis about their experience in surrender and their leadership in combat, and got into what their particular concerns were. I went from there to a place called Hilla, which was a grand palace that overlooks the ruins of ancient Babylon. It's about 40 minutes by air outside Baghdad. We interviewed 16 Marines there. That was home of the 1st Marine Division at the time. And then we flew to the Baghdad International Airport and kicked open the door of the Finance and Accounting Office of the Iraqi Airways building. And we slept on the floor there for 3.5 weeks. And every day we would get into an SUV that had a Humvee with 50 caliber machine guns, front and rear of that, and we would drive 70 miles an hour through the streets of Baghdad to link up with U.S. Army units to interview those soldiers about their leadership in combat. It was 115 degrees every day. It was incredibly difficult work. We finally quit doing interviews when all 16 Sony tape recorders were choked with dust and wouldn't work anymore. Most of them quit working before the batteries even ran down. So we flew back, definitely the grubbiest people on that airplane, flying out of Kuwait City. And we came back and we had these interviews content analyzed. And that type of analysis is done all the time by sociologists and others that need to analyze textual material for major themes. So we had coders go through all this text and code it for major themes without understanding what our interests or hypotheses were. And that's how you get objective, quantifiable information out of those kinds of interviews. Our second study was in a place called Mosul, Iraq, and it was a trust study. And in doing that trust study, we interviewed about 150 soldiers from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, in Mosul at the time. They were from the 101st Airborne Division. And then at the end, we pulled that data together, and we decided we needed at least 2 other studies. So the next study we did was a study with the West Point parachute team. One of the things I did while I was at Vanderbilt University is that I fell in with a group of people that hung out in places like Cherry Mound, Tennessee, and Eagleville, Tennessee, and I started jumping out of airplanes here. And I have not stopped. So for 12 years, I coached the West Point parachute team and was one of their instructors. It was a great experience, and it gave me access to these people who were jumping 5-6 days a week. They're anywhere from 18 to 22 years old, and they're teaching each other how to jump out of airplanes. And so I interviewed the 10 most experienced skydivers on that parachute team. They all had instructor ratings. They'd all competed nationally. They all had more than 500 jumps. And their job was to train the younger cadets. And I did comparative interviews with the sports team captains from all the NCAA sports at West Point, all of them, men and women. And then finally, I did a classic interview study where I brought people in to do my interviews who I thought epitomized the idea of an in extremis leader, a leader at the point of death. So these were people like climbing guides from the Exum School in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that take people up Everest and K2 and dangerous climbs. I interviewed a woman who took HD video teams into the Indian tiger preserves and videotaped tigers on the ground. I interviewed large formation skydiving organizers who put 300 or 400 people into free fall at the same time. I interviewed a the SWAT team chiefs from the San Francisco and the New York offices of the FBI. There were only two things that my interview population had in common. At that time, they were routinely leading people in dangerous places. That was number one. And number two, all of them had lost somebody. All of them had had somebody get killed doing what they do. And so we proceeded to interview these people and to pull together the commonalities among all these studies, And in doing that, we came up with a framework. And what I want to do now is walk through that framework for you and talk to you a little bit about how leading people in dangerous places is different than leading people in more ordinary places. So the first thing we discovered was a principle that we call inherent motivation. And it came from these data. When we were talking to these sports team captains, one of the things we asked them to do was to rank order their personal strengths in terms of 9 leadership competencies we gave them. So we gave them a list of 9 things like motivating, learning, decision-making, building organizations, leader competencies. And we said rank order those things. Number 1 competency for a sports team captain, far and away, motivating. Because think about it. Think about the track captain. They have to motivate people to run around a rubber track. That's not inherently motivating, right? Some people like to do it, but gosh, in order to do it faster than everybody, you have to be highly motivated. When we had the parachute team instructors do that same list of leader competencies, motivating was second from the bottom of a list of 9. It was not even on their scope. And so we had to dig into that. We looked into all the interview data, and we did some re-interviews, and what we found was dangerous places or crises are inherently motivating. People are already spun up. They don't need a cheerleader. They need a quiet professional. They need a quiet professional. They need someone who brings the room down. And that's very different than the type of motivational leadership that we often see in sales organizations or in businesses, which works good when there isn't a crisis. But when people are spun up because they're afraid, the last thing they need is a yeller and a screamer. They need a quiet person who doesn't get excited. And unfortunately, Hollywood gives us all the wrong role models for this. All the wrong role models. Because a Hollywood producer, or director rather, wants to excite you. They want to spin you up more. So their leaders are always screaming into a cell phone or a radio, grabbing people by the shirt, throwing something. It's all wrong. It's just all wrong. That's not what people need when things are bad. And when you actually study people who do this all the time, like my interview pool, people who work for them would say, the worse things get, the quieter they get. And that's what people need. They do not need a high motivator type in crisis. So, if the parachute team folks didn't have the ability to, they didn't think that motivating was really key for them, what was their number one competency? It was learning. It was learning. That's what people who live and work in dangerous places are occupied with doing. That was also pretty interesting to us. So we focused on that. We did some work to come and understand why that might be the case. And in doing that, what we found was 2 things. First of all, the best way to stay alive in a dangerous environment and the best way to understand a crisis is to focus outward, like Danny Brown. Because these cadets would be standing at 10,000 feet on the skid of a helicopter, holding onto a seatbelt that they didn't even use, and checking somebody else's gear, and then telling them to go. And that's the kind of thing where, you know, you can look down and that can become disconcerting to you. But if you are focused on what you're doing, if you're focused outward, it's not a problem. And as it turns out, that's neuropsychological. When we feel fear, it's in this brain structure right here called the amygdala. When we feel angry, we want to fight, we feel fearful, that's the brain structure that's electrically activated. When you task focus, you begin to activate your prefrontal cortex, which is up here. And it's very difficult to do both at the same time. And some of you may have already experienced this. Maybe you were in a car accident and you had to do something. You were definitely disoriented, but you focused outward, you did what you had to do, and you were pretty functional. And then you went and you sat by the side of the road on the curb, and that's when you start to shake. Not when you're doing it, but afterwards. That's because when you're doing it, you're in your prefrontal cortex, you're focused. When you stop doing it, you go right back into the deep, dark recesses of that amygdala, and it says, flee. It says you're afraid. So in teaching skydivers, and I've been an instructor for 14 years. I mean, I've taken thousands of people out of airplanes. When you want to keep yourselves or your soldiers calm, don't tell them to control their emotions, because when you do that, you focus inward and it just makes it worse. Tell them to focus, and better yet, give them a task. Give them something to focus on, even if it doesn't really contribute. But if they know that they've got a mission, they've got something to do, it's so much easier. And it's the same thing with financial analysts that are staring at 3 screens. You know, if you tell them they've got to do something and focus them in the middle of something that's going wrong, they'll function much better. The second thing that we learned about this, and by the way, I like to show these 2 EEG traces. The one on the left is a pistol shooter shooting at a target, practicing. The one on the right is the same shooter, same pistol, same target, but in competition. And just the difference in focus between practice and competition is a measurable shift in electrical activity in your brain. So this is not a small thing when we're talking about focusing outward to control emotions. It's a significant change in your brain, and it is learned. I don't care if you're young, old, man, woman, makes no difference. To be good at that takes a little bit of practice at it. But you can practice it all the time. You can practice it in athletics and other ways. The second thing we learned about this notion of learning from these people was that the outward focus creates the conditions for rapid learning. So if you're focused outside yourself, if you're not distracted by your own emotions and everything else, you can solve problems better. And I've gotten into some arguments with other neuropsychologists about this where they say, but you know, some of our research shows that when you put people under stress, that they don't solve problems as well. Well, I'm not talking about long division, you know. I mean, I'm talking about like interpersonal things and complex things. And you will find that teams under pressure, when they are focused outward, not when they're all worried, but when they're focused outward, can solve problems they couldn't otherwise. And part of that lesson I learned from this person about 3.5 years ago. This guy right here, his name's Matt. And Matt's parents came to me as the instructor on the West Point parachute team, and they said, more than anything else, for his 18th birthday, our son wants to learn to parachute. He wants to make a parachute jump. And I couldn't do that on behalf of the government. I'd have to do it on my own with my own rig and that sort of thing. And I said, well, why don't you just take him to a commercial parachute center? Well, the problem was Matt has autism, and Matt has Asperger's. And if you look really closely, you see how his left side here, his arm and his leg, is reduced compared to his right? And commercial parachute centers don't really like that kind of configuration on an individual because it causes spins in free fall, that asymmetry. And they would actually rather take someone who had no functioning in their legs at all, but that were symmetrical, than somebody not. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And But at the same time, I was really focused on how this person would learn. So I got with a school psychologist and with a special education teacher, and I went to school on learning. And as it turns out, one of Matt's big challenges was his inability to focus. And they said, well, he will get up in the middle of your teaching him what you need for him to do, and he'll just walk away, you know, or he has no filters. He's going to tell you need to lose 10 pounds, which I already knew. And he's just going to be hard to handle that way. So we brought him in. His mom was there. And I said, okay, Matt, today we're going to make a parachute jump. And it's not an amusement park ride. It's a real parachute jump. And if you don't listen to me and do exactly what I tell you to do, you're going to die a horrible death today right in front of your mom. So like, Mom didn't like that one bit. But you know what? Matt sat down with me, and he didn't move for 2.5 hours. He was right with me the whole time. And he got out of the airplane at 14,000 feet and fell 50 seconds and did as good as anybody that I've ever taken. He got up wanting to do it again. And he has since scuba dived. He's got a job. And they featured this jump in the American Psychological Association trade journal, The Monitor, in talking about how to use focus activities, particularly sporting activities and dangerous activities, to develop attention and focus in people that don't necessarily have as much of it as they liked. And I learned more from that kid that day than I did in years of studying neuropsychology and focus, because I saw it unfold right in front of me. And it was that pressure, and his parents are now very aggressive about putting him into situations where he's got to perform, you know, and where there's consequences for it. The next thing that we found was a concept called shared risk. And it's really pretty easy to imagine shared risk. This is sort of the classic image of the person leading from the front in crisis. But really what it means, really what the data showed us, was that if people do not believe that their leader has skin in the game, that their leader is assuming as much risk as they are, trust isn't built. It's very difficult. And it hits industry pretty profoundly when business leaders have golden parachutes and other kinds of arrangements in their compensation plans so that if the company goes down, that they're still pretty well taken care of. The line people do not understand that. And so consequently, smart business owners will take much of their remuneration in company stock, and they will project this when they're talking to their employees that, hey, if you're worried about losing your job, trust me, I have skin in this game. You know, I will lose a lot as you lose as well. And for the military people out there, you have got to be out front. You know, you cannot all of a sudden have to go do an email when things are bad. You know, you have got to be up front. And I like to use this quote from Sandy. When he saw Mayor Bloomberg, he got out there pretty quickly. I wish he wouldn't have, you know, brought his trench coat and his tie, but he was out there at least, you know, in the middle of things. But this guy right here experienced a lot of frustration. His name's James Molinaro, and he was the borough chief for Staten Island, which was the borough in New York that was pounded by Sandy. And he didn't see any Red Cross people where he was. And so on national television, with Kirsten Gillibrand and Chuck Schumer right behind him, he said, all these people making these big salaries should be out here on the front line, and I'm disappointed. And my advice to the people of Staten Island is, do not donate money to American Red Cross. Let them get their money elsewhere. He said that on national TV. Okay? Cost the Red Cross millions. And for all we know, they were working 24 hours a day for this guy at that point in time. But they weren't there. They weren't out front demonstrating shared risk, demonstrating that they had skin in the game. And so he lost confidence. He lost his ability to trust them. Okay? It's a painful lesson to learn. Related to that, we had another factor emerge called common lifestyle. And what this means is, in crisis, people like to see their leaders as being in touch with them, as being in touch with them. And what that means to leaders is, when things are bad, you have to reduce your social distance. All leaders, whether they're military leaders, civilian leaders, they tend to set themselves apart by the way they dress, by the way they show up to work, by the size of their offices, and that's fine. Shower yourself with perks when things are going well. But when things are bad, when they go bad, they want to know that you're human, and the only way to do that is to reduce social distance. We saw terrific examples of that after 9/11 when CEOs were going to funerals and taking care of families and being very personable with them. But unless you take the kind of direct steps in a crisis to reduce that social distance, here's what happens. Things start going bad. The lawyers start coming into the office. You start to have closed-door meetings. The lawyers say, don't say anything to anybody. In the military context, you start having your staff meetings. You're starting to write plans for things, but you don't want those plans to come out. So there's ponchos over the maps when the sergeants come in. And people don't know what's going on, and they begin to get spooked by it because you've increased that social distance instead of closing it down. And it's most important, we talked about this today at lunch with a couple people, when tragedy strikes. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a military unit where taking care of the dead and taking care of families has a certain amount of formality to it, or whether you run a small company and somebody's wife dies. That is not the time for you to be separate. That's the time for you to be personable, to show up where people don't expect you to be, and to deal with people on a very close one-on-one way. That's the expectation. And when it happens during a tragedy, you will have no time to think about it in advance, and it's only going to last about 48 hours, and then the opportunity's passed. So you have to think about these things a little bit in advance, because it happens. When I ask people to raise their hand about who's been in an organization where somebody's died, most people's hands go up. And how you act when people are at their worst is profoundly influential to them. And so you have to get that right. And then the last thing, and I like to use these photos for this, just to talk about this a little bit. This is a hotel in Greenwich, Connecticut, a luxury hotel. It turns out that they have an incredibly good generator set in this hotel. And there were 4 CEOs from power companies on the East Coast who put themselves and their families in this hotel during Hurricane Sandy. While their people were out picking up live wires, climbing poles in the pouring rain, trying to get power to people who didn't have it for months in some cases. And this never made the papers in New York. The only reason I know about this is that one of our senior faculty members went to the same hotel and he saw these folks there. But I will tell you that in circumstances where people are miserable, or when circumstances when people are afraid, if they see leaders separate themselves socially like that, don't count on getting any kind of trust or loyalty out of those people. You have to be closer than that. And then the last thing we found is something that sounds kind of obvious. Competence and loyalty builds trust. That's what my youngest daughter would refer to as a no-duh. You would expect to find that in any leadership study. But what you find, actually, is that in crisis, or in dangerous contexts, the value of competence goes sky high. It goes sky high. Often organizations, whether military organizations or whether civilian organizations, when they want to build trust and allegiance, they do it socially. They come, they want to play golf, have a little golf tournament. They have wine and cheese on Thursdays after work, all this social stuff. And that works pretty good as long as everything's going good. But when things go bad, all they care about is, can the boss get us out of this? That's their focus. And so my advice to these people in the back row, when you ask what's going to get you the respect of your people and what's going to allow you to perform when you're in a dangerous context with them, know your job. Know your job and be with them enough so that they see that you know your job. Don't tell them you know your job, but people have to see the boss making decisions, understand what's going on in that head, and then when things go bad, they'll have trust and confidence in them. If there's also loyalty, and I mean loyalty down. Okay? It doesn't do any good to be working for a highly competent leader if you think they might throw you under the bus. And so there has to be that caring factor or loyalty downward or however you want to label it. And it's important too, but the difference, we looked at 10 variables in Mosul about this, and the difference between competence and variable number 2 was the same as the difference between variable number 2 and variable number 10. So it's like competence plus everything else down there. But the loyalty piece, pairing a little bit of concern or caring with it, was essential. You can't do it with competence alone. And I like to underscore this, this notion that you can't show people you're competent. You can only work with them and let them infer that. And I like to use this photo from a little bit more than 2 years ago. This is a Mideast Peace Talks. And you can see all these heads of state up there. Bunch of leaders, you know. I mean, anybody would be proud to be part of this entourage walking down the hall there. But I want you to focus on this person at the upper left. This guy right here. Can you tell who that is? It's Hosni Mubarak from Egypt. Okay? When this photo was released in Egypt by the state-run media, it looked like this. They photoshopped him to the front, and they flipped him so that everybody would be in step with him. Okay? Well, you know what happened, right? Within like 24 hours, he was photoshopped in all kinds of places, all over Egypt. I mean, that was the thing to do. Where did you Photoshop Mubarak? You know, he was playing ball for the Miami Heat. He was running the Bulls in Pamplona. and it's kind of amusing, and he obviously didn't do this himself. His director of communication, now the ex-director of communication, did this. But at the same time, this happened about 2.5 months before the Arab Spring. He did not need that. You know, he did not need that loss of face and that loss of legitimacy that comes from trying to look better than you are, or trying to, in an inauthentic way, show your competence or your position or anything else. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine have radar for that. They can smell that a mile away. And so can most of the people who have worked in companies and businesses for a long time, because they see business leaders come and go, and they know who knows their job and who doesn't. It has to be authentic. So in the course of going through this, we've talked a lot about psychology. We've talked a lot about how to lead in difficult and dangerous places, and how that is different than leading in other places. So at this point, we have about 7 minutes left, something like that. I'll open it up to questions that you all might have. We've got some mics here. And I know that you don't get, you know, ex-generals and West Point people and Yale people here at Vanderbilt all the time, so I'll answer any question you ask me, whether it's about my military experience in the Army or at West Point, whether it's about the content that I had here, or whether it's about the military in general. You know, for a long time when I was in the military, I couldn't necessarily blurt out anything I wanted to, and now that I'm retired, I love it. You know, I can say anything. So I'm happy to answer any kind of questions, and thank you very much for your attentiveness during this presentation. I appreciate it. Okay, so the question was, how has social media changed leadership styles or the need for certain leadership styles in a wartime context? It's interesting. Social media can be pretty powerful. Most leaders right now avoid it. If you look at major CEOs of corporations or business leaders, 68% of them do not have social media presence and do not use that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you look at what young lieutenants and captains and junior officers are doing right now, the vast majority of them have a strong social media presence. And that in wartime has done some good things and it's done some bad things. One of the most important things that it's done is that it's brought families and service members together in ways that they feel supported and much, much closer. I commanded an artillery battalion in the Republic of Korea in 1997 to 1999. And at that time, what I was watching was the emergence of email availability to soldiers in a deployed environment, because I had about 900 soldiers and almost all of them were there without family and were going to be there for a year. And our ability to put soldiers into social media so that they can talk to their family or they can see what's going on back at home has been huge. It's opened up the life of soldiers to the media in another way that hadn't been done before. So that has had positive effects. There are some obvious security challenges with that. But on the whole, it's been very, very good to have deployed people connected. And they expect it. They expect to be connected. My son-in-law had 3 overseas tours. His last one was in Iraq, or excuse me, in Afghanistan. And he got internet connectivity into his little hooch and had to pay $800 a month for it. Now, he went in with a bunch of guys, so they weren't all paying that much. But that's how badly they wanted it, and that's how important it is in that context. Now, blow this outward in a more official way. The ability to have connectivity on the battlefield can mean the difference between life and death. And when you talk to general officers and colonels about how to lead, almost all the leadership they do on the battlefield is virtual because it's so distributed. I had a Harvard MBA who was working for me at West Point deploy to Iraq in 2003, 2004 for 6 months. His name was Pat Michaelis. And he took a briefcase with about $800,000 in it, and he bought a bunch of hardware and set up a network, a social network among Army captains who were commanding in Iraq. Because what we were finding was that as soon as we discovered how to defeat an IED placement strategy that the Iraqis had, let's say they were burying them at night, and so we put snipers out with night vision goggles and we shot the bad guys in. Well, then they would do something else. So they would cut a hole in the bottom of a bus. They would drive a bus down the road and stop it, and it would be there about 15 minutes, and it would drive away, and there'd be an IED under it. So what Pat did was he connected everybody in the 1st Cavalry Division, all these captains, probably 200 of them. And when one of them figured out what was going on, everybody else knew it in a matter of seconds. Nothing had to flow upward to the higher headquarters and then come back down as intelligence. It just went out, boom. And consequently, the Iraqis could never catch up. I mean, they called it CavNet. It provided them the information they needed in real time. So they're both sort of off-duty social things that are really, really important that social media has done, and in the official context, the ability to communicate laterally, instantaneously, in real time has never, ever been more important. So, great question. Thanks. Yes? Yeah, I think one that I would come on right away is the ability to give honest and straightforward feedback to people. And I actually, in teaching at Yale, I actually go to Yale Drama and to the arts for that. Because, you know, here's the thing about feedback. Most of us don't like to give it. We really don't like to receive it from people. But artists do it all the time. I mean, that is like the coin of the realm for an artist, is to create something and then have other knowledgeable people pick it apart all day long. And it's gut-wrenching, but that's what they do. And consequently, their ability to take that critique and turn it into something is really good. Some people from other environments, business, military, whatever, require a lot of practice at that. But I think, I know I have in my own teaching taken that from the arts and drama, from places that are kind of unlikely, really critical in dangerous places, because when people feel criticized for the decisions they're making or for the actions that they're taking in a dangerous place, sometimes they get upset about that, you know, pretty quickly. And there are also some strong norms against sort of armchair quarterbacking. When people get hurt or killed, you know, in some sense we think about investigations and things, but among the professionals, they do not question one another's judgment, you know, that led to those events for the most part, because they know that when you are in that environment, you are making decisions with the best info you have at that time, and sometimes the enemy gets a vote, and sometimes, you know, things don't go wrong. In a business, sometimes you have a peer competitor that wants you to fail, or in politics for that matter. So that's the piece that I think we really cross over in those two areas that are important. How do those people communicate with one another about the quality and nature of work without creating this emotional turbulence? You know, how do they learn? And when you look at this from the perspective of developmental psychology, and you look at the psychology of, for example, Bob Keegan, who talks about, you know, moving through stages, people who are at the higher stages are self-authoring. They have enough esteem and they're really creating their own identity. They don't get it from other people. And I think that's what we really have to do in leader development, is create people who are confident enough in themselves that when they do a piece of work, that they know there's always going to be something that could be improved, and they can hear that from other people and not run screaming from the room, you know, not be emotionally affected by that. So that's what I think right off the top of my head. If I sat down with you, we could probably figure out some other things. But. Terrific.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Michael Jabley. I'm a fourth-class midshipman here at the Navy NROTC unit. And I'd first like to thank you for your time. This has been very informative. And I was curious about those interviews you conducted in Kuwait with the Iraqi prisoners of war. And I'm wondering what the general feeling was there, what their reaction was, how they reacted to you asking questions about touchy subjects like surrender, and basically how that went. Was there any hostility?
Yeah, that is really fascinating, and I really had to fight my way through a lot of sociologists who argued that even talking to them was unethical because they were prisoners. And they're also, unbeknownst to me at the time, I only found out about 2 years later that there was actually a memo by Paul Wolfowitz saying that prisoners wouldn't be interviewed for any reason. Luckily, I didn't find that before I went and did it. I talked to them mostly about their leaders, their relationship with their leaders. And to put you in the frame of what this was like, 115 degrees, we're on the tailgate of a Mitsubishi SUV. We couldn't go and bring prisoners out of their little cantonment areas, because if we did, their fellow prisoners would think that they were ratting them out or getting special treatment, and they would probably beat them. So we waited outside the medical tent until the sick or wounded Iraqis went to the tent, and do what all of us find ourselves doing much of the time, and that is waiting for a doctor. Okay? And so while they were waiting, we'd have our translator approach them with some dried pineapple and some fresh water and say, "We're writing a book. Would you like to come talk to us?" And so they would talk to us. And this was really difficult for the translator because there was a lot of dialect and idiom that was not familiar to the Arabic professor that I brought along. I mean, he's a full colonel. He'd been teaching Arabic at West Point for more than 10 years, but he'd ask a question, and the Iraqi would begin to speak, and he would turn to me and say, "I haven't understood a word he said for the last 15 minutes." You know? And so we had to bring those tapes back. We actually took them to Yale, and stroke of good fortune, my brother-in-law is a Middle East Studies professor and a native from Tunisia. And so he was able, for 2 cases of beer, to transcribe all of the tapes that the Iraqis gave us. They were absolutely fascinating, talking about the nature of leadership in the Iraqi army. Much of it had grown out of the British regimental tradition because many Iraqi senior leaders would go to Great Britain, to Sandhurst to be trained and then come back. But it was also very authoritarian. And so what they described as happening was as soon as the first bomb hit or as soon as a tank blew up, and they couldn't even see the Apache that blew the tank up, they would just walk away. And we had actually dropped leaflets asking them to bury their weapons and walk away, but they took their weapons with them because there were Ba'athist death squads in the rear that would try to kill them while they walked back to Najaf or Hilla or wherever they were from. And I asked them, the most interesting question I asked them was, did your leaders force you to fight? Because that's kind of what we were getting from the media, that the Iraqi soldiers were actually being forced to fight from their positions by their leaders. And I talked to 36 of them, and every single one of them said no. And I said, well, why not? And they said, because we'd have killed them. I mean, we had guns. So we were leaving whether they wanted us to leave or not. And you can connect that to an important lesson that I talk about a little bit in my book about our own experiences in the Vietnam War. You know, we had some serious leadership challenges in the Army during Vietnam, and it got bad enough that we created an actual name for someone who would take a fragmentation grenade and throw it at their leader as a way of getting back at the leader because maybe the leader wanted to force them to fight or was breaking up their drug ring or whatever, and we called it fragging. And some of you may remember stories of this. But what you may not realize is how pervasive it was. The Department of Defense started keeping track of what they called assaults with explosives in 1969 for the last 4 years of the Vietnam War. And according to the DoD records, in those 4 years, 69 to 72, there were 788 assaults with explosives. Followers trying to kill their leaders with a fragmentation grenade. Since we deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 12 years or so, we've had 2. That is the difference between a conscript army in an unpopular and unwinnable war and a professional army of volunteers, like these people that are in the back row here. That's the difference in quality of leadership. And we saw the same thing among the Iraqis. They were leaving, and it really didn't matter what their leaders said. And I think it's an important lesson for everyone, particularly military people, because they put this rank on our shoulders. We get it from Title 10 of the United States Code, and we think that because we have that rank on our shoulders that maybe we can compel people to do things. Well, that happens pretty well in peacetime. You can compel people to do things in an organization where everything is going right. But in a dangerous context or in a crisis, you can't compel people. You can't incentivize them with pay. You can't threaten them with a fine because they're facing something that's much worse than that. So unless you've built the kind of influence that a leader needs to lead without all that authority, then you're not ready. And You know, that's the one thing you should always try to do, is lead without that rank on your shoulder. If you can influence people and compel them to do things without having to turn to that stick that Title 10 of the Code gives you, you are much better off, especially in a dangerous environment. Especially in a dangerous environment. Okay? Thanks, Michael. I have time for one more.
General Thomas, my name is Gregory Taylor, and I took a writer's aptitude test once which said I have understanding of emotions. And my question to you is, did you interview any people who were in the civil rights movement, those who were old enough to still be around? And my reason for asking that is, there was a term in the 60s and even today that referenced the movement as an emotional commotion that's being handed down from generation to generation. And I think that a lot of African Americans have actually OD'd on the MLK dream. And I would like to know if you have a way of gauging if we are in the midst of a second wave of an emotional movement.
Well, that is probably one of the best questions that I've gotten ever, speaking on this topic. And this idea of collective emotion, you know, and emotion being contagious, which it definitely is.
Yes.
And it's a good point for most of the leaders in here to understand, is that elements of emotion become collectivized and people get spun up together. And we've seen that. You see this in the news all the time. It's pretty easy to fabricate a crisis and to get people spun up. I did not interview anyone from that movement or focused on that movement, but I think it's a fascinating idea that we may be in a cyclical way,
Yes.
going through that in again.
Yes.
And I also think that the people who can harness that and who understand how to take that kind of power and then do something positive with it
Yes.
are going to be some of the greatest leaders of our age.
Thank you.
So thank you for that.
Yes.
Folks, I really have had a great time here tonight. Thank you so much. Thanks, Scott. Thank you.